terrifying weapons in human history. The V-2 rocket, the jet fighter, the atomic bomb. But in the classified files of the U.S. military, sandwiched between radar schematics and nuclear physics, lies a weapon so bizarre it sounds like fiction. It wasn't a missile, it wasn't a tank, it was a mammal. The plan was simple, yet insane. Strap tiny napalm bombs to thousands of bats, drop them over Japanese cities, and watch the country burn. This wasn't a fringe conspiracy theory. It was an official U.S. military operation, codenamed Project X-Ray. It was endorsed by the president, tested by the Marines, and invented by a dentist. This is the true story of how
Take a moment to honor one of the last remaining survivors of the USS Arizona attacked at Pearl Harbor. He's passed away at the age of 102. Ken Potts was shuttling supplies to the battleship on the morning of December 7th, 1941, when he heard an explosion, then got on a boat and started pulling his fellow servicemen out of the oil-slicked water after they were tossed or forced to jump from the ship. In a 2020 interview, he talked about how that day that will live in infamy stayed with him years later.
Even after I got out of the Navy, if I was out in the open and heard a siren, I'd shake.
More than 2,400 Americans were killed in that Japanese attack, and nearly half of those fatalities were from the USS Arizona.
The United States almost won the war with flying rodents. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Navy strikes Pearl Harbor. The United States is thrust into chaos and rage. While generals planned counterattacks, a dentist named Lytle S. Adams was on vacation at Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Adams was watching millions of Mexican free-tailed bats spiral out of the caves at dusk. He was struck by two facts. First, there were millions of them. Second, they could carry their young, which were nearly their own body weight, in flight. A light bulb went off. Japan's cities were built largely of wood and paper. If he could weaponize these bats to roost in the eaves of Japanese homes, he could start thousands of fires simultaneously, overwhelming firefighters. Most people would have let this idea die, but Lytle Adams knew people. Specifically, he was friends with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Less than a month after Pearl Harbor, on January 12, 1942, Adams sent a letter to the White House. He wrote, "This man could carry this war to Japan with an army of bats, devastating the morale of the Japanese people." Incredibly, the letter reached President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Instead of laughing, FDR passed it to Colonel William J. Donovan, the head of wartime intelligence. FDR's accompanying memo contained a single famous line: "This man is not a nut." It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into. Project X-Ray was born. The Army Air Force took over the project in 1943, but turning a bat into a bomber required serious science. They needed a team. They recruited Louis Fieser, the Harvard chemist who had just invented a new sticky incendiary jelly known as napalm. Fieser designed a miniature bomb, light enough for a bat to carry, but deadly enough to burn down a house. It weighed just 17 grams. The plan relied on the biology of the Mexican free-tailed bat. These bats could carry loads exceeding their own body weight, but how do you transport them? Engineers designed a bombshell-shaped canister. Inside, it contained 26 stacked trays, like an egg carton, holding 1,040 hibernating bats. The bats would be cooled into a state of hibernation, essentially asleep. The plane would drop the canister from 5,000 feet. At 1,000 feet, a parachute would deploy, the canister would pop open, and the warming air would wake the bats up. Once awake, the bats would scatter. Instinct would drive them to find dark, dry places to hide before dawn. In Japan, that meant the attics of wooden houses. A time delay fuse on the bat's chest would tick down, and then ignition. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it was a catastrophe. In May 1943, the Army began testing at the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Base in New Mexico. The goal was to demonstrate the handling of the bats. But bats are not soldiers. They do not follow orders. During a calibration test, a group of armed bats was accidentally released while the cooling mechanism was off. The bats were wide awake, and they were armed with live napalm. They did exactly what they were designed to do. They sought darkness. The bats flew into the testing facility's control tower. They flew into the barracks. They flew under the general's car. Moments later, the timers went off. The Carlsbad Army airfield burned to the ground. The fire destroyed the test range, the hangar, and a general's personal vehicle. It was a PR nightmare, but it proved one thing undeniably: the weapon worked. The official report stated, "The regular bomb gives a large explosion, but the incendiary bat gives a surprise fire which is extremely difficult to locate." Following the disaster, the Army passed the project like a hot potato to the Navy and then to the Marine Corps. The Marines were enthusiastic. They scheduled a full combat deployment for mid-1945. By 1944, Project X-Ray had cost the U.S. government an estimated $2 million, equivalent to over $30 million today. They had the bats, they had the bombs, and they had the targets. But Lytle Adams had a problem. He was in a race he didn't know about. While Adams was freezing bats in caves, thousands of scientists in Los Alamos were working on the Manhattan Project. The military high command faced a choice. Project X-Ray was effective, but it was slow. It would take months to breed enough bats and deploy them to burn Japanese cities one by one. The atomic bomb, however, promised to end the war in a single flash. Fleet Admiral Ernest King ordered a timeline. He was told the bats wouldn't be combat-ready until mid-1945. The atomic bomb would be ready around the same time. The military didn't need two city-destroying weapons. They chose physics over biology. In 1944, Project X-Ray was unceremoniously canceled. Lytle Adams never gave up on his idea. Even after the war, he maintained that the bat bomb would have been more humane than the atomic bomb. He argued that the slow-spreading fires would have given civilians time to flee, unlike the instant annihilation of Hiroshima. History is filled with what-ifs. We often think of technology moving in a straight line towards progress, but Project X-Ray reminds us that in desperation of war, even the most absurd ideas are taken seriously. We were one decision away from a history book where the Second World War was won not by splitting the atom, but by thousands of flaming bats. I'm OYZ, and this is History Unburied. Thanks for watching.